The crystal chandeliers of the grand ballroom cast a deceptive warmth over the rehearsal dinner, a scene meticulously crafted for celebration. Laughter and the gentle clinking of fine china filled the air, a symphony of anticipated joy. Lena, radiant in a sapphire silk dress that matched the sparkle in her eyes, moved through the crowd with a lightness she had carried for months. In 3 days she would marry Alex, the man who had promised her a lifetime. Her hand rested on his arm, a familiar anchor in the sea of well-wishers. She felt the solid weight of his presence, the future they had planned together seeming as tangible as the diamond on her finger. Then the music faded, and a sharp, metallic clinking sound cut through the murmur of conversations. All eyes turned toward the head table where Alex stood, tapping his fork against his champagne flute. A charming, practiced smile graced his lips, but it did not reach his eyes. Lena felt a prickle of unease, a cold draft in the room's warmth. He began to speak, his voice smooth and carrying, thanking everyone for coming. His words were generic, a bland recitation that lacked the heartfelt emotion the moment demanded. He spoke of the future, but his gaze drifted over the heads of their guests, never quite landing on her. The air grew thick, charged with a tension that only Lena seemed to feel. Then, his tone shifted. The charming facade cracked, revealing something colder, harder beneath. He cleared his throat, his fingers tightening around the stem of his glass. He looked directly at her then, and the ice in his eyes froze the breath in her lungs. He declared, his voice ringing with a cruel, deliberate clarity, that this was all a mistake. He said the wedding was off. A collective, horrified gasp rippled through the room, but it was the words that followed that shattered her world. He looked at her, at the love and dreams shining in her face, and told everyone assembled that Lena was simply not enough. Not ambitious enough, not polished enough, not the partner he needed for the life he intended to build. The silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum that swallowed all sound. Lena's vision tunneled, the faces of her family and friends blurring into a smear of pity and shock. The sapphire dress felt like a costume of a fool. The diamond on her finger was a brand of her gullibility. She could feel the heat of 100 stares, a physical weight of humiliation pressing down on her, crushing the vibrant woman she had been moments before into a small, broken thing. She saw her mother's hand fly to her mouth, her father's face pale with disbelief. And through it all Alex stood, his expression one of cold finality, as if he had simply concluded a difficult business negotiation. He did not look at her again. He set his glass down with a definitive click and walked away, leaving her standing alone in the center of the ballroom. The whispers began, a rising tide of sound that crashed over her. The carefully constructed future evaporated, leaving behind only the stark, brutal reality of his rejection. The fragments of her heart lay at her feet, visible for all to see. She was utterly exposed, completely alone in a room full of people, the echo of his words. Not enough, not enough, not enough. The only thing she could hear. The silence of her apartment was a physical presence, thick and heavy, pressing in on Lena from all sides. The drive home had been a blur of streaking streetlights and the hollow roar of the engine, a numb escape from the carnage of the ballroom. Now, standing in her own hallway, the weight of the evening crashed down with the force of a tidal wave. Her knees buckled, and she slid down the smooth surface of the wall, the cool plaster a stark contrast to the burning shame on her skin. The sapphire dress, once a symbol of joy, was now a twisted shroud, its fabric scratching against her raw nerves. She tore at the tiny buttons, desperate to be free of it, and the delicate silk ripped with a sound like a sob. She curled into a tight ball on the cold hardwood floor, the emptiness of the rooms around her echoing the vast hollow space inside her chest. Every time she closed her eyes, she was back there. The glittering chandeliers morphed into 1,000 accusing eyes. The clinking of his fork against the glass was a sound that would haunt her forever. But it was the other memories, the ones from before, that cut the deepest. They came unbidden, cruel flashes of a past that now felt like a lie. A memory surfaced of a rainy afternoon, curled together on this very floor, planning their future. Alex had traced the lines of her palm, his voice soft with a promise she had foolishly believed. He had spoken of a house by the water, of children with her laugh, of growing old surrounded by the life they would build. The warmth of that moment, the absolute certainty of his love, now felt like a mockery. Another flash, sharper and more recent, his frown as she'd shown him her latest design project, a cozy, intimate cafe. "It's a bit small, isn't it?" he had said, his tone dismissive. Not exactly a legacy project. She had brushed it off then, attributing it to his high-pressure career, his drive for grand, impressive things. Now, she saw the pattern, the subtle critiques of her friends, the way he'd suggested she take a more corporate career path, the slow, insidious erosion of her confidence that she had mistaken for his high standards. His cruelty at the dinner wasn't an anomaly. It was the final, public execution of a dream he had been quietly dismantling for months. A choked sound escaped her, a raw mixture of grief and fury. She had believed in their shared future so completely that she had no blueprint for this sudden, desolate present. The wedding invitations, the caterer, the florist, all the carefully laid plans were now just kindling for the fire of her humiliation. She was adrift in the wreckage of a life that was supposed to start in 3 days. The sharp, insistent buzz of the doorbell cut through her spiraling thoughts. She ignored it, pressing her face harder against her knees, willing the world to disappear. It buzzed again, longer this time, followed by a frantic knocking. Then, a key turned in the lock. The familiar, hurried footsteps of her best friend Sarah clicked across the floor. Lena didn't look up, but she felt Sarah's presence sink down beside her. There were no questions, no empty platitudes. Sarah simply wrapped her arms around Lena's trembling form, pulling her into a fierce, wordless hug. The simple, unconditional comfort broke the last of Lena's resolve. Sobs racked her body, deep, shuddering waves of anguish that had been held back by shock. She cried for the love she thought was real, for the future that was stolen, for the woman she had been, who had believed she was enough. Sarah held her through it all, a silent anchor in the storm, her own tears warm against Lena's hair, a testament to a shared grief for a dream that was now, irrevocably, dead. The grief did not vanish overnight, but it began to change form, hardening from a suffocating cloud of despair into a cold, sharp stone of resolve in the pit of Lena's stomach. The tears she had shed on Sarah's shoulder had washed away the last remnants of the woman who had blindly trusted, who had built her happiness on the shifting sands of another's approval. In their place stood someone new, someone forged in the fire of public humiliation. The echo of Alex's words, "Not enough," no longer triggered a spiral of shame. Instead, they became a mantra of defiance. She would be enough, but only for herself. The first act of this new life was a quiet, deliberate severance. Sitting at her sleek, minimalist desk for the last time, the corporate marketing job that Alex had always deemed suitable felt like a costume that no longer fit. She opened her email, her fingers steady on the keyboard. The resignation letter was brief, professional, and utterly final. There was no explanation, no dramatic flourish, just a simple statement of termination. Hitting send was not an act of panic, but of liberation. A weight she hadn't even fully acknowledged lifted, the sterile air of the office suddenly feeling lighter, filled with possibility instead of obligation. Packing her apartment was an archaeological dig through the ruins of her old life. Each object was weighed and measured. The expensive, impersonal art prints Alex had chosen were stacked for donation. The sleek, modern sofa they had bought together held no sentimental value, only the memory of countless evenings where she had tried to mold herself into the sophisticated partner he wanted. She kept only what resonated with her true self. She carefully wrapped the vintage ceramic vase she had found at a flea market, its imperfect hand-painted flowers, a testament to beauty found in uniqueness. She folded the soft, colorful blankets her grandmother had knitted, their warmth a comfort Alex had always dismissed as quaint. Into a separate small box went the few photographs of them that she could not yet bring herself to discard, not out of lingering affection, but as a reminder of the price of forgetting one's own worth. The final morning in the city dawned gray and soft. Lena stood in the empty living room, the space echoing with the ghosts of a life that was no longer hers. Sarah arrived, her presence a steadying constant. They loaded the last of the boxes into a rental van, a physical manifestation of Lena's departure. The city skyline, once a symbol of shared ambition, now looked like a cage she was gratefully leaving behind. As she merged onto the highway heading north, a profound sense of calm settled over her. She was not running away, she was moving towards something. Her new city was smaller, nestled against a wide blue river. The apartment she had rented sight unseen was a sun-drenched loft with high ceilings and exposed brick, a blank canvas filled with dusty golden light. As she carried the first box inside, her eyes were not on the dust or the emptiness, but on the potential. She could already see where her drafting table would go, flooded with morning light. She imagined walls painted in warm, earthy tones, shelves filled with fabric swatches and design books, a space that was entirely, unapologetically hers. Unpacking, she saved one box for last. It was filled with her portfolio, sketches of cozy reading nooks, vibrant restaurant concepts, serene bedroom sanctuaries, designs Alex had called unambitious. She spread the drawings out on the bare floor, their colors vibrant against the worn wood. This was her passion, her talent, the core of her that he had tried to diminish. A fierce, protective love for this part of herself bloomed in her chest. She would build a life here, not on the foundation of someone else's expectations, but on the bedrock of her own creativity and strength. The vow was silent, but absolute, etched into her very soul as she looked out her new window at the unfamiliar, promising skyline. She would never again hand anyone the power to tell her who she was or what she was worth. Her worth was hers to define, and her new beginning started now. The silence in Alex's penthouse was a different creature than the one that had haunted Lena's apartment. His was a vast, expensive quiet, polished to a high gloss by marble floors and floor-to-ceiling windows that framed a glittering, indifferent city. For the first few days, that silence had felt like victory. It was the sound of freedom, of burdens lifted, of a future unencumbered by what he had come to see as sentimental weight. He had stretched out on his designer sofa, a glass of single malt whiskey in hand, and breathed in the sterile, controlled air. He had made the tough, necessary call, the kind that separated winners from the sentimental losers of the world. The memory of Lena's shattered face was a fleeting discomfort, a small price for the liberation of his ambitions, but the silence began to curdle. The empty expanse of the penthouse, once a symbol of his success, started to feel less like a sanctuary and more like a gilded cage. The absence of her things, the throw blanket she'd always draped over the back of the sofa, the small cluster of scented candles on the coffee table, the faint, lingering trace of her perfume in the hallway, created a negative space that grew more pronounced with each passing hour. His business meetings, once the thrilling center of his universe, began to feel hollow. The ruthless negotiations and strategic power plays that had once fueled him now seemed like a pointless pantomime performed for an audience of one. Driven by a restlessness he couldn't name, he found himself scrolling through social media late one night, a habit he had always derided as trivial. His thumb moved mechanically until it stopped, frozen on a photograph. It was Sarah's profile, and she had tagged Lena. The image was of a sun-drenched loft, all exposed brick and golden light. In the background, Lena stood, her back to the camera, her hair caught in a messy bun as she unrolled a large sheet of paper, a design schematic. She was wearing paint-splattered jeans and a simple t-shirt, and her posture was one of focused, vibrant energy. She looked utterly absorbed, completely at home. The caption read, "Watching my favorite human build her empire from the ground up. So proud." A cold, sharp stone settled in Alex's gut. This was not the broken, weeping woman he had expected to find, or perhaps secretly hoped for. This was a phoenix, risen and radiant. He devoured every subsequent post, each one a fresh laceration. A picture of a completed cozy cafe interior, all warm wood and intimate lighting credited to her new design firm. A shot of her laughing with a group of new friends at an art gallery opening, her face alive with a confidence he had never seen. She was thriving. She was building her legacy, just as he had always claimed to want. But hers was built on passion, not on the cold calculus of balance sheets. The gnawing emptiness inside him widened into a chasm. He canceled a series of important meetings, citing a vague illness, and spent the days brooding in the penthouse's oppressive silence. He stared out at the city, but instead of seeing a kingdom to be conquered, he saw 1,000 windows behind which people were living, loving, and creating. He had nothing but the echo of his own footsteps. The relief he had felt was a phantom, a fleeting chemical reaction that had masked a deeper truth. His cruel declaration at the rehearsal dinner had not been a moment of brutal honesty, but one of profound cowardice. He saw it now with agonizing clarity. Lena's warmth, her creativity, her unwavering belief in the beauty of small things, these were not weaknesses. They were a strength he had been too insecure to comprehend. Her world was not small. It was deep and rich and real. His ambition was not grand. It was a hollow performance, a desperate attempt to fill a void he now realized he had carried long before he met her. He hadn't left her because she wasn't enough. He had destroyed them because he was terrified that he himself was the one who was lacking, and that her brilliant, genuine light would eventually expose him. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning, its subject line stark and promising against the clutter of Lena's inbox. Prestigious contract offer, Sterling Global Enterprises. For a moment she simply stared, the name resonating with a weight she couldn't quite place. Sterling Global was a titan in commercial real estate development, known for its sleek, intimidating towers that pierced skylines. This was not the cozy cafe or the boutique hotel she had been building her reputation on. This was the major leagues. The project was the redesign of their flagship corporate headquarters, a multi-million-dollar endeavor that would be featured in every major design publication. Her hands trembled slightly as she clicked open the attachment, the detailed brief outlining a vision of innovative warmth and collaborative luxury. They had seen her portfolio online, the very one Alex had dismissed, and been impressed by her unique ability to weave humanity into sterile spaces. Winning the contract felt less like a victory and more like a seismic shift in her reality. The congratulatory calls, the flurry of contract negotiations, the first substantial deposit hitting her business account, it all coalesced into a tangible confirmation of the new life she had forged. She hired 2 junior designers, leased a proper studio space with her name on the door, and dove into the work with a ferocious joy. The Sterling project became her world, her days a whirlwind of material samples, architectural plans, and color palettes. She was at long last building her empire, and the foundation was solid. The first on-site project meeting was held in Sterling Global's current boardroom, a cavernous space of dark wood and cold chrome that perfectly embodied the corporate sterility her design was meant to dismantle. She moved through the corridors with a quiet confidence, her portfolio tucked under her arm, her posture straight in a tailored blazer that spoke of professionalism, not the desperate polish of her past life. As she waited for the senior partners to arrive, she lingered near the polished coffee station, mentally sketching ways to soften the room's harsh angles. It was then that the murmur of voices from a nearby open office doorway caught her attention. 2 men in sharp suits, their backs to her, were speaking in the hushed, grave tones reserved for corporate disasters. Completely overleveraged, one said, shaking his head. The venture capital pulled out last week. It's a bloodbath. The other man let out a low whistle. Axton's finished then. I heard he's liquidating personal assets just to cover the payroll for another month. Hubris, plain and simple, thought he was untouchable. The name, Axton, hit Lena with the force of a physical blow. Alex's surname. The failing business venture he had talked about for years, the one he had claimed required a certain kind of partner, a certain kind of life, the one he had used as justification for so much. She stood frozen, the sterile air of the boardroom suddenly thick and difficult to breathe. The men continued, their conversation a stark litany of financial ruin, defaulted loans, a collapsed merger, total insolvency. A complex, bitter cocktail of emotions stirred within her. A sharp, undeniable pang of pity surfaced first, the human reflex to wince at another's suffering. She pictured him in that empty penthouse, the gilded cage now a prison of his own making, the silence no longer a victory, but an accusation. The man who had valued ambition above all else was being devoured by it, but the pity was swiftly followed by a dark, cold wave of satisfaction, so potent it tasted like metal on her tongue. This was the grand legacy he had chosen over her. This was the important life that had required him to publicly dismantle her. The universe, it seemed, possessed a brutal, poetic sense of justice. She took a slow, deliberate breath, smoothing the front of her blazer. The junior partners arrived then, all smiles and handshakes, ushering her into the boardroom. As she took her seat at the vast mahogany table, the center of attention and respect, the whispers of Alex's downfall became a distant echo. She was here, in the heart of a global enterprise, hired for her talent, respected for her vision. And he was out there, drowning in the consequences of his own choices. The twist of fate was complete, and as she began to present her designs, her voice steady and sure, Lena felt the final lingering ghost of his rejection finally, irrevocably, release its hold on her. The grand ballroom of the Carlton Hotel was a symphony of curated opulence, a world of crystal champagne, and the low, cultured hum of wealth and influence. It was a world Lena now navigated not as an outsider hoping for acceptance, but as a creator whose work had earned her a place at the table. The annual Children's Hope Foundation Gala was the social event of the season, and her presence as the newly acclaimed designer for Sterling Global was a testament to her arrival. She moved through the crowd with an easy grace, the deep emerald silk of her gown whispering against the floor. The dress was a masterpiece of simple, elegant lines, cut to accentuate her form without begging for attention, its color making her skin glow and her eyes sparkle with a quiet, unshakable confidence. A single, flawless diamond pendant rested at her throat, a gift to herself after signing the Sterling contract, a symbol of her own worth, chosen by her alone. She accepted a glass of champagne from a passing waiter, her smile genuine as she exchanged pleasantries with a city councilwoman, her posture radiating a warmth and assurance that drew people in. It was across this sea of sequins and black ties that her gaze, momentarily adrift, snagged on a familiar silhouette. The air left her lungs in a soft, soundless rush. There, hovering near a potted fern as if hoping to blend into the foliage, was Alex. The sight of him was a physical jolt, a discordant note in the evening's harmonious melody. The man she had once known as the epitome of controlled, polished ambition was gone. In his place stood a stranger, frayed at the edges. His tuxedo, once impeccably tailored, now seemed to hang on him, the jacket wrinkled across the shoulders. His hair, usually styled with meticulous precision, was disheveled, as if he had run his hands through it repeatedly. But it was his face that held her captive. The arrogant, handsome lines were etched with a new, deep weariness, his skin pale and taut over his cheekbones. His eyes, which had once looked at her with cold finality, now darted around the room with a desperate, hunted intensity, scanning the crowd not for opportunity but for a lifeline. He had not seen her yet. He was focused on an older gentleman, a potential investor Lena recognized, and his body language was a study in supplication. He leaned in too close, his gestures slightly too broad, his laugh at something the man said a hollow, strained sound that carried across the space. The investor offered a tight, dismissive smile before turning away to greet someone else, and Alex seemed to physically deflate, his shoulders slumping in a posture of pure defeat. It was in that moment of unraveling that his frantic gaze finally swept in her direction and landed directly on her. Time seemed to warp, the cacophony of the gala fading into a dull roar. The space between them crackled with a tense, silent electricity. His eyes widened, a flash of stunned recognition that quickly morphed into a raw, unguarded anguish. He looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time since he had destroyed her in another ballroom a lifetime ago. He took in the radiant woman in the emerald gown, the easy confidence in her stance, the diamond that glittered not as a promise from him, but as a trophy of her own success. The contrast between them was a brutal, unspoken poem. She was the embodiment of everything he had claimed she could never be: successful, self-possessed, and utterly complete without him. His own reflection was his ruin. In her luminous presence, his disheveled desperation was thrown into stark, unforgiving relief. He was a ghost at the feast, a reminder of a path not taken, while she was the vibrant, living proof of a destiny claimed. His mouth opened slightly as if to form a word, a name, a plea, but no sound emerged. The desperate hope in his eyes warred with the dawning, humiliating realization of their reversed fortunes. He was the one who was not enough to keep his business afloat, not enough to command respect in this room, not enough to ever deserve a second glance from the woman he had thrown away. Lena held his gaze for one long, suspended moment. There was no smile of triumph, no glare of vengeance. Her expression was one of calm, almost detached observation, as if she were studying a particularly poignant piece of art. She saw the entire tragic arc of his downfall written in the lines of his face, and she felt a distant, quiet pity, like one might feel for a shipwreck seen from the safety of a distant shore. Then, with a grace that was both natural and deliberate, she gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod, a silent, final acknowledgement of the chasm between them, and turned away. She melted back into the glittering crowd, the emerald silk a banner of her victory, leaving him alone in his desperate silence, the phantom of his own hubris. The gala's glittering facade could not contain the storm of desperation that now propelled Alex forward. He moved through the throng of laughing, oblivious guests as a man possessed, his gaze locked on the emerald silk of Lena's retreating gown. The brief, silent exchange across the ballroom had been a public execution of his pride, but it had also ignited a final, frantic ember of hope. He had to speak to her. He had to make her understand the depth of his regret, to beg for a sliver of the forgiveness he knew he did not deserve. He found her on the quieter terrace overlooking the city's jeweled skyline, standing alone by the stone balustrade, a solitary figure of calm against the backdrop of the distant humming city. He approached her as one might approach a cliff's edge, his steps hesitant, his breath shallow. The crisp night air did little to cool the feverish heat of his shame. He stopped a few feet away, the scent of her perfume, something light and floral, entirely new, hitting him like a physical blow, a reminder of a world and a woman he no longer knew. "Lena," he said, her name a ragged whisper torn from a place of profound brokenness. She turned, not with a start, but with a slow, measured grace that suggested she had been expecting him. Her face was illuminated by the soft glow of the terrace lights, serene and utterly composed. There was no anger in her eyes, no flicker of the old pain, only a quiet, impenetrable stillness that was far more terrifying. He swallowed hard, the words he had rehearsed crumbling to dust in his mouth. He saw the diamond at her throat, the confident set of her shoulders, the absolute peace in her posture, and it shattered the last of his composure. The carefully constructed apology, the eloquent admission of fault, it all vanished, leaving only raw, unvarnished truth. "I was wrong," he choked out, the confession ripped from the deepest, most wounded part of him. His hands trembled at his sides. "What I did, what I said, it was the most monstrous, cowardly act of my life. You were always enough. You were everything. I was just too blind, too arrogant, too terrified of my own emptiness to see it." He took a half-step closer, his voice dropping to a desperate, pleading whisper. "I am so sorry, Lena. I am broken without you. Please, is there any chance at all for forgiveness? For us?" He stood before her, laid bare, a ruined king begging for a kingdom he had willingly burned to the ground. He waited for her anger, for her tears, for any emotional storm that would prove he could still reach her, that the past was not entirely dead. Lena regarded him for a long, silent moment, her head tilted slightly as if listening to a faint, distant melody. The city lights twinkled in her calm eyes. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft even, and carried a finality that was more absolute than any shout. "I forgive you, Alex." The words were not the balm he had hoped for. They were a verdict. They held no warmth, no promise of reconciliation. They were a simple statement of fact, a burden she was setting down, not for him, but for herself. She continued, her gaze steady and clear. "I have started seeing someone. A colleague. He's kind, and he sees the world with a generosity I had forgotten existed. A faint, genuine smile touched her lips, a small, private thing that had nothing to do with him. He makes me laugh and he respects my work. He's building a life, not just a portfolio. There is no us anymore, Alex. That chapter is closed. I have no interest in rereading it. The words landed not like blows, but like a gentle, final closing of a heavy door. Each one was a pinprick extinguishing the last flickering lights of his hope. Someone else. Kind. Generous. The adjectives were a quiet indictment of everything he was not. She was not just moving on. She had already arrived somewhere new, somewhere better, and she was happy there. The stunning clarity of her revelation left him utterly hollow. There was no fight left in him, no argument to make. The remorse that had been a gnawing beast inside him now yawned open into a vast, silent void. He had lost her, not in the dramatic public explosion of the rehearsal dinner, but in this quiet, peaceful moment on a terrace where she had calmly handed him his own obsolescence. She had not only rebuilt her life, she had built a better one, a fortress of contentment where he was nothing more than a ghost from a former life, a cautionary tale she had long since outgrown. He could only stand there, stunned into a profound, devastating silence, watching as the woman he had once called not enough walked away, more than enough for a world that no longer included him. The final collapse was not a dramatic explosion, but a slow, silent implosion, a structure giving way under the weight of its own flawed engineering. The email from his last major investor arrived at dawn, its subject line a bland corporate epitaph. Notice of withdrawal of funding, Axton Ventures. Alex read the words on his phone, the cold blue light washing over his face in the dark of his penthouse. There was no anger, no frantic phone calls to be made. The fight had bled out of him weeks ago, leaving only a hollow, accepting numbness. He knew with a chilling certainty who was behind this final, decisive blow. The investor was Sterling Global's primary financial backer. The same man Lena now worked for. The same man whose whispers of Alex's failure had first reached her ears. It was no coincidence. It was destiny's meticulously crafted retribution, a perfect circle of cause and effect closing with an elegant, brutal finality. He spent the day in a fugue state, mechanically signing the documents that would liquidate his company, selling the intellectual property he had once believed would be his legacy for pennies on the dollar to cover the debts. His staff, the ambitious young minds he had once inspired with visions of grandeur, were let go with terse apologetic emails. The office, a sleek monument to his ambition with its glass walls and panoramic city views, was surrendered back to the landlord. By evening, he was sitting on the floor of his penthouse, the last of his personal assets, a collection of expensive watches and a vintage sports car, sold to pay the final humiliating bills. The vast space was nearly empty now, the echoes of his footsteps bouncing off the bare walls, a symphony of his own ruin. The silence was absolute, a physical weight pressing down on him. In the profound stillness, his mind turned inward, replaying the film of his life on a relentless loop. He saw himself at the rehearsal dinner, standing before their families, so sure of his own superiority. He heard the cold, cruel precision of his own voice declaring Lena was not enough. The memory was no longer a source of justification, but a searing brand of his own stupidity. His hubris had been a blinding, toxic force. He had mistaken her warmth for weakness, her creativity for a lack of ambition, her depth for simplicity. He had believed that a bigger office, a more impressive title, a larger bank account were the metrics of a life well lived. He had valued the appearance of power over the substance of love. Now, destitute and utterly alone, he understood the true cost of that arrogance. The legacy he had chosen over her was dust. The business was a failed entity in a corporate database, his name a cautionary tale in financial circles. The penthouse was an empty shell. He had nothing. No one. The friends who had applauded his ruthless ambition had vanished with his fortune. The social invitations had dried up. He was a pariah, a ghost in the city he had once sought to conquer. He thought of Lena, not with the desperate longing of before, but with a clear, agonizing clarity. He saw her in her sun-drenched studio, surrounded by her designs, building something real and beautiful from the ground up. He saw her at the gala, radiant and whole, a woman who had taken the shards he had left her and forged them into something stronger and more brilliant than anything he could ever have imagined. Her success was not a twist of fate. It was the inevitable result of her talent, her integrity, and her resilience. His failure was not bad luck. It was the inevitable consequence of building a life on a foundation of insecurity and pride. A dry, humorless sound escaped him, something between a cough and a sob. This was the payback. Not a vengeful act from Lena. She had been nothing but calmly, mercifully final, but the intrinsic justice of the universe. He had sacrificed a genuine heart on the altar of his own ego, and the universe had simply balanced the scales. He was not being punished by Lena or by a vengeful god. He was reaping the harvest of the seeds he himself had sown. The man who had believed he was destined for greatness was left with nothing but the echoing silence of his own making, a living embodiment of the truth that no tower built on hubris can long endure. The retribution was perfect, complete, and entirely of his own design. The small velvet box felt like a fossil in Lena's palm, a preserved relic from a geological layer of her life that had long since been buried under new growth. She had found it tucked in the back of her jewelry case, a forgotten artifact among the pieces she actually wore. His grandmother's heirloom ring. It had never felt like hers, even when it was on her finger. It was always a symbol of a future that belonged to someone else, a character in a story she was no longer writing. Keeping it felt wrong, a tether to a ghost. Returning it felt necessary, not for him but for the final quiet act of laying a soul to rest. She found his new address through a public records search, a stark contrast to the penthouse listing she had once known. The building was a modest, weathered brick structure on a quiet, tree-lined street, a world away from the steel and glass towers of his former life. The air smelled of damp earth and blooming jasmine, a humble, honest scent. She parked her car, the box a small, dense weight in her hand. There was no nervousness in her, only a settled, profound calm. The same feeling she had when putting the final piece of furniture in a perfectly balanced room. She knocked on the door of apartment 3B, the sound firm and clear in the afternoon stillness. When it opened, the man who stood there was a stranger sculpted from the ruins of the one she had known. Alex looked older, the sharp angles of his face softened by a new weariness, but his eyes held a clarity that had been absent before. They were no longer frantic or desperate, but quiet, observant. He was dressed in simple, worn jeans and a plain t-shirt, a far cry from the custom-tailored armor of his past. For a moment he simply stared, a flicker of surprise crossing his features before it was replaced by a weary acceptance. He stepped back, a silent invitation, and she entered the small, sparsely furnished apartment. The space was clean but bare, holding only the essentials: a simple sofa, a small table, a single bookshelf with a handful of paperbacks. The grand artworks and status symbols were gone, replaced by the pale afternoon light filtering through an unadorned window. It was the home of a man who had lost everything and was starting from zero. There was a strange, stark dignity in its emptiness. Lena did not sit. She stood in the center of the room, holding out the velvet box. "I came to return this," she said, her voice even and soft. "It belongs in your family." He took it, his fingers brushing against hers for a fleeting second. The contact was neutral, devoid of the old electric charge. He didn't open the box, simply closed his hand around it, his knuckles white. He looked from the box to her face, and she saw the full understanding of the moment dawn in his eyes. This was not a negotiation. It was a delivery, the final piece of their shared history, given back. "I forgive you, Alex," she said, and this time the words were different from those on the terrace. Then they had been a shield, a declaration of her own immunity. Now they were a key, turning the lock on a door she was ready to close forever. "Truly, what you did was cruel and it broke me, but it also forced me to build myself into someone I never knew I could be. For that, in the strangest way, I am almost grateful." Her gaze was steady, holding his without accusation or pity. She was not offering him absolution, she was stating a fact of her own emotional landscape. The anger was gone. The hurt was a scar, faded and smooth. The forgiveness was real, a final release of a debt that no longer needed to be carried by either of them. He absorbed her words, his shoulders slumping not in defeat, but in a long, slow exhalation of a burden he had carried for months. He looked around the small, plain room, then back at her, a man finally seeing the world without the distorting lens of his own ego. "I accept that," he said, his voice low and rough with emotion but clear. "And I accept my fate. All of this, is what I earned." He gestured to the sparse apartment, to the ring in his hand, to the entirety of his reduced circumstances. "I was a fool, Lena. I confused having with being. I thought I was building an empire, but I was just constructing a prison for myself." He met her eyes, and for the first time his gaze held no plea, only a hard-won conviction. "I am going to change my ways, not for you or for anyone else, for me. I don't know what that looks like yet, but I know it starts here. With this." Lena nodded, a small, final gesture. There was nothing more to say. The chapter was written, its last sentence complete. She turned and walked to the door, pausing for a moment on the threshold. She did not look back. She stepped out into the gentle afternoon, pulling the door closed behind her with a soft, definitive click. The sound echoed not in the hallway but in the quiet chamber of her own heart. The sound of a story ending, making space for all the stories yet to come. Inside, Alex stood alone in the silence, the velvet box warm in his hand. The ghost of her forgiveness, a strange and unexpected kind of grace. The first solid ground he had felt beneath his feet in a very long time. The morning of Sarah's wedding dawned with a sky of such pristine, cloudless blue it felt like a fresh canvas. Lena stood before the full-length mirror in her sunlit bedroom, not with the anxious scrutiny of her past, but with a quiet, settled appreciation. The dress she had chosen was a soft, flowing lavender, the color of early twilight, and it moved with her as she did, effortlessly. There were no jagged edges to her happiness today, no shadows lurking in the corners of her smile. The woman in the reflection was whole, her joy a deep, steady wellspring, not a fragile bubble. She fastened a simple silver chain around her neck, her fingers steady and sure. Beside her on the bed, her phone buzzed with a text from Mark, her colleague turned partner, a message filled with warm emojis and excitement to see her later. A genuine, uncomplicated warmth spread through her chest. This was what peace felt like. The wedding was held in a sprawling botanical garden, a riot of color and life that mirrored the celebration itself. As Lena took her seat on the petal-strewn chairs, the string quartet began to play, and Sarah appeared at the end of the aisle, a vision of incandescent joy. Lena's heart swelled, a pure, undiluted happiness for her friend that held no trace of bitterness for the wedding that had been stolen from her. She watched the exchange of vows, the promises spoken with trembling, earnest voices, and she felt only a profound connection to the moment. Her own history was not a ghost at this feast. It was a lesson that had led her here, to this bench, in this lavender dress with a heart capable of celebrating love without fearing its loss. She caught Mark's eye from across the aisle, and his slow, easy smile was a silent conversation of shared contentment. Later, on the dance floor, with his arms around her and the music swelling, she threw her head back and laughed, the sound lost in the joyful noise, a perfect unburdened note in the symphony of the new dawn she had built for herself. At that same moment across the city, Alex was wiping down a laminate countertop, the sharp, clean scent of disinfectant filling the small, brightly lit cafe. His uniform, a simple black polo shirt and apron, was a garment of humility, and he wore it without resentment. The lunch rush had ebbed, leaving the quiet hum of the espresso machine and the soft chatter of the remaining customers. He moved with a new economy of motion, refilling a sugar jar, stacking clean cups, his focus entirely on the task at hand. There was no audience here for him to perform for, no balance sheet to obsess over, no legacy to build. There was only the simple, tangible satisfaction of a job done well. He looked out the large front window at the people passing by, couples holding hands, friends deep in conversation, individuals lost in thought. He no longer saw them as potential contacts or rivals. He saw their humanity, their simple struggles and joys, and he felt a connection to them he had never allowed himself before. A regular customer, an elderly man who came in every day for a single black coffee, gave him a nod and a small smile. Alex returned it, a genuine gesture. It was a small thing, a moment of unremarkable respect, but it landed in his soul with the weight of a revelation. This was the value he had spent his life overlooking in his pursuit of grandeur. Humility was not a defeat. It was a lens that brought the world into a sharper, truer focus. Respect was not something to be demanded from a position of power, but something to be earned through simple, honest presence. He finished wiping the counter, the surface gleaming under the fluorescent lights. He had lost everything, but in the quiet rhythm of this humble job, he was finally, truly, beginning to understand what it meant to build a life worth living. The new dawn had broken for him too, not with the blaze of a rising sun, but with the gentle, persistent light of a single unadorned bulb in a quiet cafe, illuminating the path to a man he was only just learning how to be.